discourse of corruption. I still maintain, and I say this because unless I say it, my next argument is not going to be palatable. So I will say it. By the time Jacob Zuma leaves office, corruption in South Africa is no longer endemic. It has become systemic. That is the dominant culture in both the private sector and the public sector. But corruption is not the main challenge facing South Africa. The main challenge facing South Africa is inequality. So we buy into this narrative, dominant narrative, of focusing narrowly on corruption. Because when you do so, the finger is pointing away from those who are responsible for the neo-apartheid our people still have to live through today. So if we focused on inequality, the finger would be pointing in the direction of those who benefited from colonial apartheid. If you talk corruption, you achieve two things. You give corruption a black face, but more importantly, you erase the sin of apartheid. And that is why I've become quite impatient even to participate in these discussions, because they are, to me, nothing more than misdirection. They misdirect us from the conversations we should be having if we want fundamental change in this country.
Now, talking about whiteness and about culture, for someone who grew up in white schools, who grew up idolizing whiteness, if I could say so, our culture and traditions were often called barbaric. You could not even speak your own African language at school. And I just want to understand, because the fundamental role and the fundamental problem that I saw was media, if I could say so, because every day on TV, all we see is whiteness. We want to portray whiteness. We want to live according to the norms and standards of whiteness. To what role would you say has media contributed in pushing the anti-black agenda?
Well, I will repeat one or two things I've been saying for years. And I will stop saying them the day I have no reason to repeat them. Let's talk about Western modernity. The darker side of Western modernity is coloniality. And coloniality gives us colonialism. What is behind the logic of coloniality is the idea that those who are not European and white are ontologically inferior, are not human, or at least are not as human as those who are European and white. Secondly, they are epistemologically inferior. They lack the capacity to produce knowledge and to engage with knowledge, precisely because they are not human, precisely because they are ontologically inferior. The white colonizer comes with a religion called Christianity here. And here, let me hasten to add, the problem is not Christianity, the problem is the Christian. And misappropriates, amongst other things, the 10 Commandments. And says, thou shalt have no other God but me. In other words, thou shalt have no other God but the God of my Bible. Because your God is either not God, not even a God, to the extent that he is God, he's not a true God, unlike my God, the God of my Bible. But more importantly, I am, as a white man, God's representative on earth. Therefore, I am your God. When you engage in anti-colonial struggles, you engage in a struggle against me, who is God. You engage in a struggle against God. So part of the damage that has occurred to us comes from this logic I've just articulated. But colonialism and apartheid does something else. You have a numerical minority that oppresses the numerical majority that it found in this country. But that numerical minority has become the cultural majority, whose worldview, whose ways of knowing, whose ways of seeing, whose ways of being have become dominant. And one of the reasons they have become dominant is because, as I said, whiteness is not just skin color. As I said, it's a way of seeing, way of knowing, way of being, a worldview that has become part of our own reality as black people, particularly those who are educated and Christian. In fact, the most assimilated amongst us are those who are educated. And we take pride in how adept we have become in the grammar of whiteness. So you must also remember that the media becomes part of this dynamic, but also is part of another dynamic. Remember that for capitalism to thrive, capitalism must become a god that is able to create like a god. So capitalism must produce, as Dr. Lwazulu Shaba says, must produce men and women with certain appetites. And those appetites advance the interests of capital and capitalism itself. And therefore, for capitalism to thrive, and for this dominant reality of whiteness to thrive too, a reproductive element must be introduced to society. There are certain relations, gender, class, race, culture, and so on, that must be reproduced as part of the process of creating this man and woman with particular appetites. A man who mimics the grammar of whiteness. A man who becomes uncritical of the grammar of whiteness. And one of the tools you use to reproduce this reality is the education system. Another is popular culture. Another is the media.